Blog Talk Radio.
Like sands through the hourglass, so are the days of our lives. So are the days of our lives. So are the days of our lives. Like sands through the hourglass, so are the days of our lives.
We live in a historic time, and it's incredible to see what's unfolding before our eyes. So many lies, so much deception. I think when the end is what I'm guessing. But as a Christian, my faith is just strengthened. Wars and rumors of wars on the horizon. And if we have to walk on the path of the valley of death, we will fear no evil, because we know that there's a sequel to the greatest story ever told without an equal. And so we speak with our voice and our vision. We walk day to day in our faith and our mission. We are a sign of the times, and like sand through the hourglass, so are the days of our lives. You all know how time flies, and Christ will return like a thief in the night. Question is, are you ready for His coming? Are you prepared? Are you scared and running? Why would you run from the one who made us, who loved us enough that He would die to save us? Why would you ever turn your backs on the truth? Things you never questioned in the days of your youth. Is that the truth? There's no excuse to justify disbelief when we just refuse. And Romans 1:25 says that all instead of worshiping God, they worshipped all they saw. They love material possessions, but they left them all behind at their burial procession. What's left behind is not a soul but a shadow. Think about it, what do you get in this battle? Are you fearing God? You should be. Next to Him without sin, all of us are guilty. There's no way we could be good enough. That's why Christ paid the price on the cross. Now that's love. Have you been rescued? Have you been saved? Have you been created after life from the grave? Ask yourself if you're ready for His coming. Are you prepared? Are you scared and running? Are you rescued? Are you saved? Have you been created after life from the grave? Tell me, friend, are you ready for His coming? Are you prepared? Are you scared and running? In the wilderness, are you hearing this? Have you repented for your sins and found forgiveness? Are you willing to give up what you call happiness? It's all really meaningless. We all die penniless. Ask yourself this: are you a witness? Are you doing your best to walk His footsteps? Are you seeing what's wrong when you explain this? Unashamed to proclaim the name of Jesus. Not afraid to defend the defenseless, like red, white, and blue, stand for liberty and justice. A supernatural tug of war between our free will and conscience, like a knock at a heart door. Will you walk the narrow path or the wide one? It may not be easy, but you know it's the right one. Every one of us must make this decision. This is the search for truth, not religion. In a selfish world where it's all about me, could it be that we forgot about we? Who believes anymore in humility, and that it might be better to give than to receive? In this world full of self-esteem, big hopes and dreams of being rich and have a vain thing. You think money can fix everything? When you think you're gonna take anything? Oh, what a shame if your name's been erased from the book of life because you tore out the page. Who's to blame for the choices you make? The only time that you praise when you wish for more fame. What's the gain when your soul's been exchanged? A head full of pleasure, a heart full of pain. Have you been rescued? Have you been saved? Have you been created after life from the grave? Ask yourself if you're ready for His coming. Are you prepared? Are you scared and running? Are you rescued? Are you saved? Have you been created after life from the grave? Tell me, friend, are you ready for His coming? Are you prepared? Are you scared and running?
Welcome, readers, listeners, and viewers from across America and around the world. This is Zen Garcia, FallenAngels.tv, and it's Saturday, June 18th, 2011. I do appreciate you joining us for the show. We're going to see if we can bring Doug on with us. Doug, is this you? Area code 510, is this Doug Elwell? Let me check this other number then.
630.
Hello, Doug, is this you?
Yeah, I'm 630. Can you hear me?
Great. I appreciate you calling in. There was another caller, that's why I was a little mixed up, little confused, but I am glad that we've made contact, and for the listening audience and those that have not heard of Doug's work, his latest book is Planet X, Sign of the Son of Man and the End of the Age, and he's the webmaster and author and does all the work there at mysteriousworld.com, which has been a fascinating website for a very long time, very informative, has covered a lot of the same kind of stuff that we cover on this show, dealing with prehistory as far as before Adam, pre-Adamic man, and the giants, and what Doug calls Homo Artificialis, which we'll go more into, but basically that's his label for the hybrid seed line that began with the introduction of Cain into this world, and also continued with the propagation of the hybrid line that came into being once they left the fallen angels left their first estate and then cohabitated with the daughters of man, and they also were part of siring the hybrid gene pool. So we're going to go into all those things and also talk about the connections with the serpent worship and the serpent cults. And I know Doug has been a long time fan and researcher of history, and so I'm sure he's got fascinating insights for us this evening. So, Doug, would you like to say hello to the listening audience?
Hello, everyone there at Fallen Angels TV. Look forward to an enlightening and hopefully controversial and interesting discussion about the giants.
Yeah, and we'll cover other things too. Especially we'll take our cues from the chat room as well. And if anybody wants to ask any questions, I'll be monitoring, but I won't be answering a lot of questions directly. I'll ask Doug once you do ask your questions, and we do appreciate everybody's feedback and interaction on the show. But before we go into this particular topic, Doug, let's talk a little bit about your last book, because I found it fascinating, and the shows that we did on the prior times and the previous ages, and the focus on what happened in this solar system with the battle between the Lord, the Most High, and Tiamat and the dragon, and all this that you explain in your books. I know you've probably been doing a lot of radio shows, and I know there's dozens of reviews out there. Tell us how the people in the audience and the mainstream and the rest of the world are taking your book, and do you think now is the time?
Yes, I do. I think now is the time for it to come out. I originally wanted to publish it back around 2000, but because there's so much web junk out there about Planet X, most of which was kind of occult and New Age and nature, I didn't want to have anything to do with it. A couple of years later, I thought about publishing it again around 2003, and we had that silly near flyby 2003 false prophecy that never happened. And so I decided to wait until I really had the maturity and the time to really fully finish up the book in a way that I found satisfactory. And so I ended up finishing it up last year and publishing it last year around, I think it was October or November. It was actually closer to December. I actually finished up the book on October 10th, 2010, because it was 10/10/10, the date, because the 10th planet.
Wow.
And I didn't know it at the time, but I heard 2 weeks later that apparently Dr. Sitchin died, and the same weekend I finished my book, so I thought that was very interesting, because I've been so powerfully inspired by his idea of there being a 10th planet in our solar system. It wasn't his idea originally, but he was the one who married up the original Planet X concept that was created by Percival Lowell back in, I think, 1890s, who was a mainstream and leading astronomer and the leader in the search for Planet X initially. And Sitchin, who in 1975 published his book, his critical and seminal work, The 12th Planet, which he married the idea of a 10th planet with the description of an Enuma Elish of a star, or actually a planet, that appeared in the heavens that the Babylonians called Marduk. And they described how this planet conflicted with the goddess Tiamat, which they equated with the earth. So in the ancient Babylonian mythology, and actually the Sumerians as well, and before them also, it was a very ancient Semitic mythology. And by mythology, I don't mean false. By mythology, I mean something that is kind of symbolic in character that symbolizes a higher truth, a scientific truth. That Earth had been created in its current form as a result between a conflict between a mysterious other planet in our solar system that astronomers are now looking for, calling it Planet X. And Sitchin, I think correctly, deduced that this Planet X was the same planet described in the Sumerian myths in Babylonian myths as the god, quote-unquote, god Marduk, who conflicted with Tiamat and divided her in half, creating heaven and earth from her dead body, heaven equating to the asteroid belt, at least one of the heavens equating to the asteroid belt, and the earth being the present earth, which was moved from its original orbit in the asteroid belt to its current orbit, which is an ideal orbit, closer to the sun, warmer, and able to support life. And I believe in my studies of the Bible, once again based on Sitchin's lead, that he was correct. The Bible fully supports this idea. In fact, it is a central and ultimate beginning and ending of the biblical and human narrative. Humanity was brought in by Planet X. It will be taken out by Planet X in the end. It's all about ultimately Planet X.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with you. I think it has a major part to play, and especially since I've done a lot of the same research as you as far as studying the ancient books, not just the Judeo-Christian in our heritage as far as that, but also all the Sumerian texts and anything I can find really from ancient texts from whichever cultures. I like to take it all in so that I can, from experience of having read it, come to my own conclusions and deduction, and then also take that before the Lord and ask His discernment on all that. But I wanted to ask you, Doug, if you had seen recently or heard about NASA and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory releasing an event timeline for this comet Elenin, and it's also it also merged with some currency that was put out by the Swiss that showed a particular alignment in a recent near soon to come flyover and flyby. And where do you see that as far as your own timeline and your own research?
I try not to stick too much to timelines because I really have no idea when God is returning. I think that's the way He wanted it to do. I have heard of Elenin, and it's an interesting thing to study because it could be a danger to Earth. It's possible. Elenin is probably not Planet X, so it might be related to Planet X in the sense that Planet X, as described in both the Bible and in Homo Artificialis, carries with it in its orbit a large amount of asteroidal and cometary material. So it's going to have comets and asteroids preceding it and following it and arriving at the same time it comes into the solar system. So whenever you have Planet X returning every 1,000 or more likely 2,000 years, I'm actually leaning more towards the 2,000-year figure of an orbital period, it'll have a large amount of asteroids and comets in its preceding it and following it. So right before Planet X reappears, you're going to have a large amount of asteroidal and cometary material coming near or possibly even striking Earth. And this is what I believe is described in the book of Revelation, mainly the trumpet judgments and the sixth seal judgment. Is you have this material falling on Earth that is in the orbital path of Planet X, and it is once again becoming more and more concentrated, and the percentage of meteoric and asteroidal and cometary strikes predictably increases during such a period. And I believe when I did an analysis in chapter 6 of my book, Job, the Hebrew creation epic, which my theory was and is that the book of Job is the Hebrew equivalent of an Homo Artificialis. It's the same information, astronomical information, encoded into the form of a story, except this format is more like a narrative where Job is the narrator, and it's kind of like an opera actually, except there's no deities. Since the Hebrew religion was monotheistic, they couldn't put in the deities of the Sumerians as the Babylonians did, because all the deities that appear in Homo Artificialis, those are all Sumerian except Marduk, who is a Babylonian god. And there's a political angle in Homo Artificialis too, because by having all the Sumerian deities in there, since the Babylonians conquered and that time controlled Sumer, after it had been destroyed by a fire from heaven sent by Elwell, they had to include the Sumerian gods into the story to show that Marduk was now the preeminent deity, and he was the ruler of the gods, and then he was therefore the Babylonians were the ruler of the Sumerians. But the interesting, as a side note, but it's interesting to note that every single one of the deities except for Marduk was a Sumerian deity in English. But there's no mention of any deities at all except for Satan and the quote unquote sons of God that were described near the beginning of the book, the first two chapters. People who have so that's heavily demythologized, and only one person besides God himself is given a name. The rest of them are given the generic equivalent of just sons of God, or just lesser spirits. No, there are no deities besides God, and only one opposer, who is Satan, whose name literally means adversary. But a couple of recent articles I wrote for Reader's News Network, I do a series called Planet Exegesis, and two of them, the last one I actually commented on a recent planetary conjunction where almost all the planets could be seen in about one quarter of the sky above the morning sun, which is a very unusual conjunction. And I pointed out that something very similar had happened around 1955 BC and again in 1915 BC. And this I conjectured based on the information to be found in the beginning of the book of Job, was that the beginning of the book of Job was described as having two congregations or meetings of the sons of God. This was actually a description of the two, kind of an enciphered way of describing two planetary conjunctions occurring around the time of the disaster that struck Job. So if that's true, I believe what they were saying is they were using that description of the congregation of the sons of God as a description of the congregation of the planets in heaven, kind of an encoded monotheism-friendly way of describing a conjunction of planets. And by doing so, they encoded the destruction of Job as being around 1915 BC, i.e. the second conjunction, because there was two conjunctions of the sons of God, one at the beginning and one just before Job was struck with the plague and his possessions destroyed, and that was around 1915 BC. Not coincidentally, recently a huge meteor crater has been discovered in southeastern Iraq in the region of what would have been ancient Sumer, and they believe it hit the Earth around 2000 to 3000 BC, possibly as early as 1900 BC, which would correspond well with the time of Job. And that meteor would have been big enough, it would have caused massive flooding, a huge firestorm, and just an impact blast like you would with a nuclear weapon. Exactly the kinds of things you hear described in the book of Job. In fact, only that could have caused what is described in the book of Job. Nothing else could have happened, because not even the most powerful hurricane could generate fires like described in the book of Job. And also in parallel texts of ancient Sumer. Ancient Sumerian text, lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and Ur and others, describe how their god Elwell appeared in the heaven with his seven helpers and cast down fire upon heaven, and from heaven to earth, and this destroyed ancient Sumer with a blast of fire and massive flooding and rains and just an impact blast of the type you would have from an impact event. And this is the description also describes how all the cattle and sheep were all destroyed in their sheepfolds, exactly like the book of Job. And Job was described as the chief of the men of the East. And the men of the East at that time, from the reference point of Israel, would have been Sumer. So, in my opinion, Job was actually living in or near Sumer, specifically Ur of the Chaldees, just as Abraham had been. Abraham was probably taken out just before the impact, which is why God called him out, because he knew the impact was coming and Sumer was about to be destroyed. So Abraham was called out and was sent to Canaan. But basically what it comes down to is Job is the Hebrew version of the creation epic, describing much of the same event, the Planet X material in the context of the destruction of Sumer. I can get into that in detail if you're interested.
Yeah, we will, and I want to ask you specifically because is it your opinion that the Lord has used this particular planet in previous times as judgment, and also do you think that Sodom and Gomorrah and also what we see as the remnant of the Dead Sea in the Middle East, do you think those are also signs of a similar type of judgment?
Yes, Sodom and Gomorrah would have been around about the same time, actually, as the destruction of Sumer. So yes, I do believe that. It would have been around 2000 BC or possibly 1900 BC, in that range. And the destruction of Sumer and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah would have been roughly correlates. Probably more than one crater, more than one meteorite hit Earth, because there was probably once Planet X passed through the inner solar system, it passes through in its perihelion, its closest approach to the sun. It actually passes through the asteroid belt, and as a result, it would throw all kinds of asteroidal material everywhere, like buckshot. And I guarantee many planets of the inner solar system were affected by that event. So when you have the day of the Lord occur, it literally is the day of the Lord may literally be 2,000 years, i.e., 2,000 years for the orbital path of Planet X. Every 2,000 years, you have judgments from God, because Planet X passes through the solar system and throws asteroids everywhere. And if you aren't in step with God and you're not in tune with Him, you're going to get destroyed by these asteroids, basically. And it was interesting that in some of the stories of the giants, the only thing they were really afraid of was that rocks would fall from heaven to earth on top of them. That's one of their greatest fears. And I think it was in the 18th century, explorers met some giants in South America. That was what they said. Their greatest fear is to be hit by rocks from heaven. And this is how God judges mankind every 2,000 years or so. He Planet X passes through the inner solar system, and basically huge amounts of meteorites land on Earth, as they did 2000 BC, around the time of Abraham and of Job. And Abraham was taken out of Sumer before he was destroyed, and Lot was taken out of Sodom before he was destroyed. It's the same pattern. God leaves these people in conditions of relative peace and plenty until the time where the decadence is so great that he can no longer afford to keep his people there anymore, because they're trying to get adversely affected. So he pulls them out and then destroys the place with those becoming intolerably decadent. That's the divine pattern. And it will happen again in the end times with the people of God in the end times. Will probably be taken out of the major city centers. And the major city centers will be annihilated by meteorites, just as described in the book of Revelation.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with you there as well. Now I want to ask you, because, and I know I want to tie this into the topic that we're talking about now as far as Planet X and these judgments, because it seems like these judgments are brought on a lot of these pagan cultures, and a lot of these cultures that were also hybrid races, that were infiltrated and perversely mixed with these hybrid races. I'm talking about as far as the Canaanite seed line, and also those that were sired in the time of Yared, when the fallen angels left their first estate during that time. Because we see in the book of Joshua how the Lord brought judgment on the hybrid seed line then, and how he also went to war and used hailstones in that time. Even made the sun stand still so that the massacre could take place. But that was part of the judgment on these particular cultures and races. And one of the reasons being is because they are part of these mixed lines, these hybrid lines that the Lord did not bring into being. Could you tie that together and then talk about how it was that you were led to understand as far as Cain and his hybrid line?
Well, the Canaanites were described as going after strange flesh, and it was also said that Nephilim were on the earth again at that time. The fallen angels had come down again and started rebreeding the giant lines that they had created at the beginning before the flood. To distinguish the two, I created the two different distinctions, as you described at the beginning. Homo Artificialis is the generic modified mankind. It basically means artificially manufactured mankind, or modified mankind, artificial. And I just created subcategories along the typical genus that you might use with an animal or a plant. We called them Homo Artificialis Nephili for the first generation giants before the flood. and the Homo Artificialis refi for the generation of the giants after the flood. That is the Nephilim before and the Rephaim afterwards. Rephaim means specifically those who were reborn or healed in the most generic sense, but in the sense they were brought back to life. Now, the ancients believed that they could summon the shades of the departed dead from Sheol and re-inhabit people, and use them to re-inhabit people in this life. And this was actually attempted by Hitler and his people in World War II. He came very close to rebuilding the giant line. And they may be successful in the underground. They might be attempting to do it again. I suspect we'll see giants again in the future. Literal physical tall giants, the warrior type that were encountered by Moses and also by the people before the flood. But to get back to the previous line of thought, the destruction of Sumer, I thought it was interesting that the line of the city that, or the land that Job is described living in was the land of Uz, which has no parallel in the Bible anywhere. There's no land of Uz anywhere. Uz, or usually people pronounce it Uz, which may have been the inspiration for the land of Oz in the Frank Baum's stories. I thought that was particularly interesting because the land of Uz is based on the word, I think it's Atz or something like that, Atz, the Hebrew word, which means to enchant or to be a fortune teller. So basically, by saying that Job lived in the land of Uz, they said he was living in a land of wizards. I thought that was particularly interesting because quite often in the Bible, the names of cities will be enciphered to purposely obscure them with the names that are similar. So what I suspect is that they swapped out the name of the land of Ur with the land of, which simply means the city of light, to the land of Uz, which means the city of wizards. That's what God judged them, because they had gone after strange flesh and they were engaging in witchcraft all the time. We have the similar phenomenon now with this Harry Potter thing and the aliens and all that. It's the same pattern repeating itself. And of course, the Wizard of Oz is a no-brainer. The Wizard of Uz or the Wizard of Oz is a modern revival of the ancient occultism. Frank Baum himself being a member of the Golden Dawn and heavily into occultism, and it showed in his writings. But did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did. And we also see, like with the craft and Twilight and all these different things and how they're trying to appeal to the youth, and because the youth are not getting answers from their church authorities and their pastors and preachers and teachers and even their peers, they're more susceptible to all these outside influences, and especially Hollywood and TV, and isn't that also a form of spellcraft, a form of a witchcraft with the way that they indoctrinate kids into opening themselves up to these kind of circumstances and situations, getting involved with Ouija boards, and the kids are now getting together and doing seances just for fun, and so I'd say that's kind of like black magic. Do you want to talk about that? The entire that's an interesting angle. I'm glad you brought that up. I've always thought that radio and TV are really more of a modern equivalent of the wizards that peep and mutter described in the Old Testament during the Canaanite, the wizards. Looked that up. I figured exactly what the context was. There was a description of the wizards that peep and mutter in the land of Canaan, which angered God. And I considered that may have been early forms of experimentation with radio, because wizards that peep and mutter is an excellent description of a radio technician fiddling around with the radio bandwidth, because it makes all kinds of peeping and muttering sounds. And I wonder if there wasn't isolated instances of high technology in ancient Canaan given to them by the fallen angels that allowed them to have radio communications. And they developed basic radio communications. All you need is a crystal and some sort of a microphone setup, and you can got yourself a radio. It doesn't take a lot of high technology to build a radio. So I always wondered if the description of the wizards, when I was searching for a description of wizards, when I was looking at the Wizard of Oz angle I just described, the wizards of Peep and Mutter use that magic
And really, even in the early days of radio and TV, it was described as a magical medium. The TV was described as a magic lantern. It was all kind of like magical, and it had a magical influence on people in the way they live and they think and the way they live. Marshall McLuhan talked about how the very existence of television and radio was modifying the way that we behaved. We now, instead of going home and talking to people, maybe reading the Bible, we're watching television or listening to radio instead. So it's not only the medium, the message, it's also the medium that's having this magical effect of changing the way people live and think. And in the end of their spell, they'll begin directly injecting occult messages in order to modify mankind to think in terms of Christianity is bad, occultism is good. And they've come
right
where everyone believes that they can be powerful if they just take on the spirits of the undead and drink blood, and they become a werewolf and they can have superpowers. They can be like X-Men, the X-Men, they can evolve to a superior form, quote unquote, of human life, which is really exactly what the Giants are all about, is modified men with superior powers. And that's where we come full circle once again. In the time of Sumer, which was also the time of Abraham, and later during the time of Moses, and now they're coming back again. It's coming time for judgment, and that's why I decided to release the book on Planet X, because it's like a 2-minute warning. It's about to happen again. You guys better snap out of it, or you're going to get smashed with giant rocks once again, and you'll have no one but yourselves to blame.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with you that all that is part of either the Great Deception coming and the loose of the fallen angels and all that is connected. Do you see that also tied to the Planet X and also, as far as we mentioned earlier, the trumpet judgments and the moon going dark and the sun being darkened and the moon blood red and those particular signs?
Yeah, I talked at length in my book about how the various signs, the book Planet X, the sign of the Son of Man and the End of the Age, about how the various signs of the trumpets were basically descriptions of what would happen if asteroids and comets hit Earth or pass through its atmosphere. We talked at length about the wormwood event, which I believe is actually a comet filled with ancient vegetable and animal material which have been pulverized and shot into space as a result of the giant impact, and bits of it occasionally fall back to Earth again. In this case, a very large chunk falls again in the end times. And this ancient vegetable and animal material, once it enters Earth's atmosphere, it had been flash fried and freeze dried in space, but once it enters Earth's atmosphere, it becomes reconstituted with the water in Earth's atmosphere, and it falls down into our lakes and rivers and forms lakes and rivers of blood, because it's literally dried animal bits falling back into Earth's hydrosphere and reconstituting as blood and really just pulverized flesh. And the plant component I found particularly interesting, because if you had a lot of plants that are super concentrated, they're having that reintroduced back into the water cycle in a concentrated way. Particularly if these plants were like, I forget the name of that one particular drink. It was made from distilled plant, and it was kind of a narcotic effect. If that was reintroduced back into the water table, this would have the effect of making everyone have hallucinogenic visions. And that would explain the people who are using drugs to try to escape reality at that time will be given the worst drug trip of their lives as a punishment. I thought that was particularly interesting and cogent. And the angels even say that they spilled the blood of our servants, let us give them blood to drink. And so all the judgments appear to be judgments against the sinful behaviors that the people of earth are committing. Everything they try to do, every sin they commit, will be met with a form of punishment that is like that sin, but it's painful in nature and not pleasant. And basically the entire end times, except for the first few seals, this is basically God judging Earth using Planet X. And of course, at the end, he comes himself with his army of angels and finishes off what's left of the army of the beast and takes control. But by far, the greatest, the heavy lifting is done by Planet X and the asteroids, cometary material in its orbital path, pulverizing everything that's on the Earth at that time.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with you. And for those that are just tuning in, because we've had a lot of listeners just join the chat room, we're talking to Doug Elwell. He's the webmaster of MysteriousWorld.com, and he's recently published the book Planet X, Sign of the Son of Man and the End of the Age, which we've done shows previously. If you want to check out the archives, we did a show on the prior times where we explained all that and how it all tied into the Babylonian epic creation tale, the Enuma Elish, and also some passages that we brought out from a book done by Zecharia Sitchin, the Lost Book of Enki, and we talked about all that. I want to go back to the beginning now, Doug, and tie this all into, because, you know, since I wrote that book, Lucifer, Father of Cain, and I talked to you about, there's been a lot of email feedback and discussion on fallenangels.tv talking about what the fruit was in the garden and how it led to the prophecies and the judgments in Genesis chapter 3. And I'm always careful because the Lord said, you know, that if they touch of this fruit or eat of this tree, that they would then succumb to death, that they would die. And so it's my opinion that whatever it was, that fruit, the tree of the knowledge, it was something that led to them being in a fallen state and then incarnating into the flesh, and then Eve, you know, becoming pregnant with Cain, and then Adam having to work the soil, and, you know, Satan and his whole line, that he would have his own seed line, and that there would be this enmity between the seed lines. But since you had mentioned also, you know, about as far as hallucinogenics and also about the tree of knowledge, because some people say that it was a fruit that might have been a hallucinogenic plant that elevated them, opened their eyes, and made them as watchers, and that once they invited the, you know, to know the knowledge of good and evil, that then they fell into incarnation as far as the flesh, and then all the things that were discussed in Genesis chapter 3 by the Lord were then fulfilled. Can you tell us a little bit about your research into this and how you see it?
Okay, that is a core part of actually what I've written about and what I'm writing about it in my new book on giants that's coming out this fall. And
awesome.
Yeah, we'll have a full book of giants. It's lots more information about the giants, including the fall of Lucifer and even the creation of the universe, and why everything was created, and how Lucifer acted, and why he did it, what he did, and his agenda, God's agenda, and so forth, in detail, so it all makes sense. But regarding the tree of knowledge, I thought it was particularly interesting. Now, this is a tree, one of two trees in the garden, one of which gives life, and the other one has knowledge. Now, the tree of life apparently gave Adam and Eve eternal life because God cut them off from the tree of life because once they'd eaten the tree of knowledge, he was afraid that they would continue to eat from the tree of life and live forever. Therefore, by being cut off from the tree of life, they would no longer live forever. And therefore, before that, they had been effectively, they could have lived forever. The tree of knowledge is immortal. That's the word. Thank you. But the tree of knowledge is something very different. It was very interesting, and it's actually, my angle is going to be very controversial because it's going to be very different from what you're used to. And your idea about the fruit having hallucinogenic properties is interesting, but I think there's much more to it than that. It was clearly symbolic. I'll go on an aside and talk about a similar parallel text and talking about the Epic of Gilgamesh. And in Gilgamesh, when he was trying to find the plant of life, that would give him eternal life, he passed through the underworld. And in the underworld, he found the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden was actually in a cave at the end of a long tunnel. And in this cave was actually trees, and like in the garden, but these trees were actually made up of crystals and they were festooned with jewels. The fruit was actually jewels that were hanging from the trees, like fruit. Now that is an interesting angle, and it also corroborates with Ezekiel I think it's 31, which is a description of the fall of I think it was Lucifer, or he's described as living on the mountain of God, because he had stolen something, and he had been cast down from the mountain, which is he had been surrounded by the stones of fire, or literally fire stones, and this is actually closer to the description of the Babylonian, or the Epic of Gilgamesh, which describes these fruits as being like stones that gave off light, jewels. So I think what we have here, when you combine both references to the Garden of Eden, both in Genesis and in the book of, was it either Ezekiel or it was Isaiah? Okay, maybe it was Isaiah. But I'll get back to that. But basically, you have a situation where these fruits are actually jewels, and these jewels will somehow. Yes, it was Ezekiel 31. Okay, let me read it to you. It's interesting. Because not everyone's familiar with this passage. People have a tendency to read the book of Genesis, and that's it, ad absurdum. There's nothing else. And there's all kinds of other stuff out there which gives additional description. Let's see. Okay, I'm still having a problem finding it. But basically it said that he lived amongst the stones of fire. And because apparently he had stolen one of these stones, he was cast down from the mountain of God and down to earth. So what I think was that this tree, this fruit, was actually a stone of some kind, a stone which held all knowledge. And the stone was, I think, actually a form of crystal, possibly lapis lazuli or a sapphire stone, because in Exodus, the Torah stone is actually described as a block of lapis lazuli or as a sapphire, in which was inscribed the law. And so what I think was we have the same stone, or possibly a similar stone. Adam and Eve had looked into the stone by a kind of some sort of a computer-type interface and had learned about things they shouldn't have learned. It's what we would call high technology, advanced understanding of things, including nanotechnology. And Satan used that stone, that knowledge, to teach them to become what we would call scientists. He gave them a very advanced understanding of technology. And as a result, their eyes were opened. And I found this particularly interesting because in the text of God created them what is called skins of animals after he found out their eyes were open. And the actual text says that he created for them aprons, very similar to in the sense of the Masonic apron. So what I'm thinking was that Adam and Eve are actually the first, what we would call Freemasons, in that they became scientists and learners of occult knowledge, things that they should not have known. And they became so powerful and so wise that they were able to, given Satan's knowledge from Satan through the stone, that they were able to fight against God himself, or at least put up some sort of a fight against him. And so God realized that not only these people are not my friends, they are actually my enemies, so I'll have to throw them out of the garden, lest they become too powerful and impossible to control, like Satan himself. So the tree of the garden of knowledge of good and evil was actually, we would consider to be a computer, using some sort of crystal technology that contained massive amounts of high technological information that, once understood, made them too dangerous to be kept in Eden. And so God threw them out of Eden and away from the tree of life, which would have kept them alive forever, had they remained compliant and not so uppity. He would have kept them alive forever. They would have had perfect peace. But because they chose to follow the way of Satan, i.e. the way of knowledge, and a means to fight against God and have their own life and their own world and their own kingdom, God threw them out and said, okay, you're going to die. I'm going to throw you out of the mountain of God like I threw out Satan. Eden probably actually being on a mountain. And so they lived out their lives and eventually died, all their knowledge dying with them. So that's why he did it. He realized that they were just too dangerous to be kept alive. But he used them to create new children. And he created Abel and Cain. Abel was, of course, killed by Cain, the seed of the serpent. And as it turned out, Cain and Abel, God had his man Abel, but Satan had his man Cain. And Satan used Cain to kill Abel. Cain being the first of the giants, strictly speaking, Homo Artificialis, that artificially manufactured or modified mankind. And God created a second man named Seth, from which Noah and eventually Jesus came eventually through that line. That was the righteous line. But the wicked line was Cain, and Cain was the line of where the Nephilim came from. Those are the first giants. And God gave him some high technology. I can get into this in detail. It's pretty controversial, but it's important to understand this. The very stone that was used at the Tree of Knowledge he gave to Cain as a means to defend himself. Perhaps you've seen Egyptian headdresses in ancient Egypt. These various deities had headdresses on their heads, which would look like two horns surrounding a central sphere. That's what the mark of Cain was. It was a headdress. And that central sphere was this stone that had been used as the Tree of Knowledge. That stone contained all knowledge. It also could be used as a means of defense, because it would also send out a huge a stream of fire to anyone who came too close. And this is the way that Cain was defended from people who tried to kill him. This was the mark that was put on the head of Cain. It wasn't like an engraving or like a 666 or anything like that. It was actually a headdress that he wore that defended him. And literally, when somebody tried to kill him, that fire would come forth from that headdress and kill anyone who tried to harm him. And this is actually what it did in the Egyptian mythology too. This is what it performed. This is the role it performed in Egyptian mythology. Anyone tried to approach a god or actually a priest. Sometimes priests wore these things too, or pharaohs. It was believed that fire would lance out from this headdress and destroy them. And so when I studied these headdresses, generically titled the Eye of Re, or the Eye of Horus, in Egyptian mythology, I realized, this is very similar to what Cain may have worn, and the reason, the secret of their power, this great eye they wore on their head as a means of control and conquest.
Huh. Well, that's very interesting, Doug, and I have to tell you, I've never heard it interpreted that way. So I'm truly interested in reading your book, because I know that you list all your sources. So just curiously, and then we'll go more into this. Can you tell us where you're getting your sources for as far as this interpretation of the Tree of Knowledge and the fruit?
It's been a couple of years since I wrote about it, but I basically went into the Hebrew text, and I studied the Torah stone and the Ark concept and everything about it. And I realized that it was very similar in many respects to some of the mythologies of the Egyptians. And in fact, Elwell and Aholiab, the guys who built the Ark, were no doubt taught by the Egyptians in the art of the temple, in woodworking and also gold, handling gold, because they came out of Egypt. That's where they would have learned, in the universities of Egypt. They wouldn't. I doubt the Hebrews had their own tradition. Oh, they might have, but I doubt it. And the Egyptians had arks of their own all the time. They carried the idols inside of the arks, so that was typical. Having an ark-like object was part and parcel of Egyptian religion as well. And this all revolves around an article I wrote, still online, A Mysterious World, called The Exodus Revelation, much of which is still in notes form. I stopped publishing it because I realized it was just too huge to relegate to such a minor series of articles, so I'm going to try to integrate it into my book, my stories about the giants, and the fall of Lucifer and his crown being this very thing that was given to Cain. That this is lapis lazuli. That lapis lazuli, the mineral, seems to show up in key parts of not only Hebrew but also Egyptian mythology. And like I said before, the Torah stone was actually carved from lapis lazuli. It wasn't made of some generic rock or granite. And lapis lazuli, by the way, is only available in that region in Afghanistan, and also I think in Peru. Those are the only two places on the earth that have significant quantities of lapis, which is interesting because our armies are dominating and controlling that area right now. And there's a reason for that. As we'll discover, I'm going to write a third book in a series about the end times. First one about Planet X, second about the giants, third about the end times, and then wrapping it up and how it'll unfold in the end times. And this technology will be once again central. It's a technology having to do with lapis lazuli and/or possibly star sapphire. It's not very clear because interpreters interpret it either way. but it's some sort of mineral, probably lapis lazuli, which can somehow be harnessed to generate enormous amounts of energy and focus it down to a narrow beam, which can cause enormous destruction, or kind of a generic field of healing. Or it can also be used to store knowledge. And as an aside, and the next generation of computer hard drives will actually be made of crystal, because we're maxing out how much space we can get on a flat hard drive now. We're looking more towards holographic, three-dimensional hard drives, which are made of crystal. And you can actually use a laser to read and write to crystal lattices inside of a quartz crystal, for example. It's a very good way of storing information. You can store much more than you can on a standard hard drive. In fact, you really literally could store all knowledge on a good-sized chunk of crystal if you have the ability to, if you have it on hand and the appropriate apparatus to write to that crystal. So what I suspect was that the finger of God described in Exodus, writing the law to the block of stone, lapis lazuli, or possibly sapphire, was that it was actually inscribing all knowledge inside of the stone. That the same all knowledge that Adam and Eve were tempted by and took advantage of to their detriment. They learned about everything, all knowledge, all technology, all science, absolutely everything there is to know, they knew it. And since they effectively could live forever, they may have been studying for thousands of years, and had become so wise and so powerful, like these, these Sith lords. they eventually could control life itself. It had become too dangerous, so they had to be thrown out of the garden and removed from the source of knowledge. Even though he eventually gave this headdress, which, if you want to really get, I have a lot of ideas. I'll explain. Kind of an interesting aside. I noticed there was a Star Trek episode in the original series. It was, I forget the title, but it was about these women who lived underground. It was called Spock's Brain. That's what it was. Maybe you've seen it. And these women, this woman kind of appeared one day on the Enterprise, and took Spock with her. And the thing was that she put on this headdress, which gave her enormous amounts of knowledge, enough to be some kind of super scientist. And she was able to remove Spock's brain and put it into this central computer system, and he could then be used to run the entire complex. But I thought that was interesting, is because it was once again this underground paradise full of beautiful women, and all the men lived above ground. And this woman would put on this headdress, and it would give her all knowledge. I suspect that was a cipher for the events of the Exodus, because on one of the possible Mount Sinai's, there was actually one called Serpent al-Qadim. This is the one I talk about in my article on the Exodus Revelation. Serpent al-Qadim is a twin-peaked mountain located in southwestern Sinai. And there was actually what was called a Hathor temple there, and this was an ancient fertility goddess. And Hathor was known for her horns. She wore the horned headdress, just like you see in typical mythology. And I suspect that this headdress was the very same headdress that Cain and ultimately, originally Eve and Adam wore. When they put that headdress on, it would put all this knowledge in their mind and teach them. And it also explains why Moses, when he went up to the mount, when he came down from the mount, was described as having horns, because he also put this headdress on, and God used it to teach him the knowledge that he wanted to know. And he'd been up there for 40 days, and when he came down, he still had the headdress on, probably forgot he was wearing it. And the people, it's typically translated as rays of light, but the literal word there is Karen, which is horns. It literally says in the text, Moses wore horns on his head. So when I put this all together, thinking there was a Hathor temple there, and there was this headdress of knowledge, which in Egyptian mythology was known as the Eye of Re, which gave you all knowledge and all the ability to see everything and understand everything. And whoever wore this would gain this knowledge. Hathor was believed to have this, and she had a temple on Mount Sinai. It's possible that this device was real, and whatever Hathor priestess wore this headdress was able to have all knowledge. And that's why they were so powerful, is because they were able to foresee events and so forth. And eventually God sent the Israelites to take them out, possibly because they were getting too powerful and too wicked. And he gave the headdress to Moses. And Moses was then used to learn the arts and the ways of God. And he gave Moses the headdress because he had God's complete trust, because he was a very meek man. He wasn't a man who was looking to conquer the world. And this is the key, one of the key reasons he says Moses was very humble, because God would only give this device to a man who was very humble and give him that kind of knowledge, because everyone before that had used it to try to conquer from Eve onwards.
Well,
that's my crazy theory, but I think... Go ahead.
No, you go ahead and finish your thought, and then I'll ask you this question.
That's my cutting-edge theory on the Tree of Knowledge. It was actually basically a technological device which you can wear on your head, and it gave you all knowledge. And Eve was tempted into using that, even though she was told specifically not to. It gave her great wisdom and knowledge, and as a result, she rebelled against God and led Adam into rebellion with her.
Well, that's truly interesting. And you said your next book will be out in the fall. Can you tell us what the name
I may or may not include that part, because Tom asked me to keep it more conservative. But I may, if not in the book, I will probably put that into the series of articles online for free.
Okay, all right.
One way or another. That information has to get out.
Yeah, we look forward to listening to it and reading it. I wanted to ask you, Doug, if you had ever heard of the story of Adam and Eve as far as what is being referenced in the Coleman Bible, because this is an interesting story, and it's new, and it gives a different twist to the story too. And so I was going to read this real quick and then get you to comment on it. And it's interesting to hear. Anyways, it'll be good for the listening audience to get exposure to this. But this is the story of Adam and Eve, not the full story, but as spoken of part of it. From the Coleman Bible, and it calls Eve Ma'eva, and Adam is called Dedam. It says this. It's kind of an interesting story. Part of this was given to Ma'eva, and the rest was drunk by the Yoslings from their awful enkidle during their night rites. When the morning came, they were all smitten with grievous pains, and before the sun set that day, all the Yoslings were stricken with a sickness such as they had not known before. Ma'eva took what had been given to her, and finding Dedam, lay low in his bed, gave him a drop from her vessel. And though she had to use womanly wiles to get him to drink it, she drank the remainder, and they both slept. But when they awoke in the morning, both were suffering pains, and this was something that they had not known before. Dedam said to the woman, "What have you done? For what has happened to us cannot be, unless the things which are forbidden have been done." The woman replied, "Lord, I was tempted and I fell. I have done that which is forbidden and unforgivable." Dedam said, "I am bound by duty to do certain things, but first let us go into the geyser, to the place called Beth Kel-Chris, where I will seek enlightenment." So they went there together and stood before the shrine beneath the tree of wisdom. There they were filled with an inflowing vision, seeing themselves as they were and as they should have been, and they were ashamed. He, because he had not followed the proper path of a man, and she, because her falsity. There, in the reflecting mist, the contamination of the woman was revealed, and the man's heart shriveled within him like a flower licked by a flame. Then they saw a great spirit being materializing in the reflecting mist, and he said to them, "Woe to you and your house, for the greatest of evils has befallen the race of the children of God, and it is defiled. The heritage of Kadamampa is lost. The fetid flow defiling the woman results from the incompatible intermingling, but it is not all, for sickness and diseases are also generating from the fragments of the impure implantation." Dedam said, "The fault is with the woman. Wherefore should I suffer?" The spirit being replied, "Because you two are now as one. The cankerworms of disease and sickness strike both equally, but you shall not again defile this place. Henceforth, the misty veil becomes an impenetrable barrier, severing our two realms from each other so that they can no longer be easily spanned. Between us there will now be no means of communication. Henceforth, Man and woman, fated to unite in love divine, shall be divided and set apart. Though ever yearning reunion, they may cleave one to the other, seeking the unity which will rekindle the flame. But unless their efforts transcend the limitations of earthly things, they will be in vain. The spirit of man is now severed from the whole and cast into the unconsciousness, and it too shall long for reunion with the whole. The spark that shall seek to return to the fire, for otherwise it becomes nothing. The web of fate is rewoven and the path of destiny remade. The design of life is redrawn, and again the progression begins in ignorance, birth and death, pain and pleasure, joy and sorrow, success and failure, love and hate, peace and war. All the light and shade, the many hues making the splendidly intricate pattern of life on earth. This is a new beginning, but a beginning not in purity and unencumbered, but one already weighted with debts and burdens. And that's from the Colburn Bible. But I thought it was interesting in that in the story it mentions some particular draught that was made during some full moon ceremony, how they drank that, and that made them pass out. They were then raped or infiltrated, and Eve was, it said, then, planted with this impure seed, the seed of Cain, and it said that this impure intermingling is also what would lead to, their being severed from the whole. So I just thought that was interesting. I want to get you to comment on that story, Doug.
Well, it sounds like the implication of Cain. Obviously, they had learned the rites and rituals during their study of all knowledge, means of contacting other powers that would give them the ability to rebel against God and be independent, do their own thing their own way. That was just what Satan wanted them to do. Did I mention a worm in there? I thought that was particularly interesting.
Yeah, I had mentioned the canker worms and disease, that also was put into her with the seed of Cain.
Yeah. So I thought one of the things I was following during my articles in the Exodus of Revelation was consistent references to worms, having to do with the fallen angels and their technology. Right before, consistently throughout the Exodus period, and right before they attacked the Amalekites, right before they came to Sinai, God mentioned, and it did it in kind of a grandiose way, if you follow me, I will protect you from the disease of Egypt. Now this worm, I followed this line, this thread, if you will, of line, and it was interesting to note that the disease of Egypt was kind of unusual. It's described in various ways as either being something called zarat or the Megefa, which literally means a disease that strikes at the foot. And it's also known as zarat, which means something that it's like a disease that comes out of the ground and it infiltrates you through your foot. That's the term Megefa, the disease that strikes at the foot. And I think that I traced this back, I believe it's through a word study, that the same word appeared, or something similar appeared in the book of Genesis, that right as a result of Adam and Eve's sin, when they go out into the text literally said, worms would, or threads or something, would grow inside of your skin. It didn't say, I think the text is translated as, let me take a look at it. It's something about, the text is translated currently as being like, worms will grow on your food and the field will not yield its produce. But what the text literally says is, worms will grow out of your skin. And I was concerned about that because that's similar to the curse of Eden of the Zarat. It was actually kind of a worm that grew in and out of their skin, and it formed what looked like threads that came out of red patches. And that's described in detail in Leviticus 13, and the cure is also given. But this problem apparently not only occurred during the Exodus period, it also appeared as a result of the sin of Adam and Eve. They as a result of their fall, they were stricken with some kind of worm-like disease, which was their curse. It kept them down. It kept them sick. It kept them somehow under control. And I followed that line in Exodus Revelation, and it appears to be in contradistinction to the manna. The manna and the worm appear to be at odds with each other. In fact, when the manna fell, all that was not eaten by the people by the end of the day. It was eaten up by these mysterious worms that came out of the ground, these thin red thread-like worms that came out of the ground. Very similar in description to the Zerat. And I suspect that what it comes down to is the activity of the fallen angels. Actually, there's one more passage. It's described when Lucifer was thrown down. It was described as he was thrown down in some sort of a vessel, and there was worms covering it. And once again, I noted that Lucifer was thrown down to heaven. It says literally he was thrown down in and it was called a nebel, or literally translated as bottle or a vessel, generally speaking. When it came down from heaven to earth, that vessel was covered with these worms. Same word is used to describe the worms in Exodus, and I think also in Genesis. I'll have to check that. But you have this every time you have evil, the activity of evil, you have these worms showing up. And I'm suspecting that Satan chose these worms. Are you familiar with that concept? Satan seems to be using these worms as a means of infiltrating the human body and controlling it. And I think we talked about that a couple of interviews ago. That may be reappearing today in the form of Morgellons. So wherever you have sinful activity, abandonment of traditional values, rebellion against God, you have the reappearance of these worms. And I think Morgellons may be a recurrence of this disease in our modern times.
That is interesting. Because it reminds me of a passage from Isaiah 14 when the Lord is talking about a judgment against Lucifer, Satan at the end of days, and he. Well, I'll read it real quick. It says this: Hell from beneath is moved for thee to meet thee at thy coming. It stirreth up the dead for thee, even all the chief ones of the earth. It has raised up from their thrones all the kings of the nations. All they shall speak and say unto thee, Art thou also become weak as we? Art thou become like unto us? Thy pomp is brought down to the grave, and the noise of thy vials. The worm is spread under thee, and the worms cover thee. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Yet thou shalt be brought down to hell, to the sides of the pit. Also, Doug, I was going to make one other comment, too. I believe I have that passage that you were talking about in Ezekiel 31, but I think it's Ezekiel 28 that you're referencing. I'll read it real quick. I'll read it real quick just so the listening audience will know what you're talking about, and then you can quote it, the part that you were talking about specifically.
Yes.
But it says this: Son of man, say unto the prince of Tyrus, Thus saith the Lord God, because thine heart is lifted up, and thou hast said, I am a God. I sit in the seat of God in the midst of the seas. Yet thou art a man, and not God. Though thou set thine heart as the heart of God, behold, thou art wiser than Daniel. There is no secret that they can hide from thee. With thy wisdom and with thine understanding thou hast gotten thee riches, and hast gotten gold and silver into thy treasuries. By thy great wisdom and traffic hast thou increased thy riches, and thine heart is lifted up because of thy riches. Therefore, thus saith the Lord God, because thou hast set thine heart as the heart of God, behold, therefore I will bring strangers upon thee, the terrible of the nations, and they shall draw their swords against the beauty of thy wisdom. They shall defile thy brightness. They shall bring thee down to the pit, and thou shalt die, the death of them that are slain in the midst of the seas. Wilt thou yet say before him that slayeth thee, I am God? But thou shalt be a man, and no God, in the hand of him that slayeth thee. Thou shalt die in the death of the uncircumcised by the hand of strangers. For I have spoken it, saith the Lord God. Moreover, the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, take up a lamentation for the king of Tyrus, and say unto him, Thus saith the Lord God, Thou sealest up the sum, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. Thou hast been in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was thy covering, the sardius, topaz, and the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, and the jasper, the sapphire, the emerald, and the carbuncle, and the gold. The workmanship of thy tabrets and of thy pipes was prepared in thee in the day that thou wast created. Thou art the anointed cherub that covereth, and I have set thee so. Thou wast upon the holy mountain of God. Thou hast walked up and down in the midst of the stones of fire. Thou wast perfect in thy ways from the day that thou wast created, till iniquity was found in thee. By the multitude of thy merchandise they have filled the midst of thee with violence, and thou hast sinned. Therefore I will cast thee as profane out of the mountain of God, and I will destroy thee, O covering cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. Thine heart was lifted up because of thy beauty. Thou hast corrupted thy wisdom by reason of thy brightness. I will cast thee to the ground. I will lay thee before kings that may behold thee. Thou hast defiled thy sanctuaries by the multitude of thine iniquities, by the iniquity of thy traffic. Therefore, I'm sorry, I just lost my place.
Will I bring forth a fire from the midst of thee?
Yes. Okay. Well, anyways, that's from Ezekiel chapter 28, and you can read the rest of it if you'd like to follow up on that passage, because it is attributed to Satan. Doug, do you want to comment on that?
Yes, thanks for doing that. I forget which one it was. It's been a couple of, literally, I wrote most of that in kind of this spirit-filled frenzy, year 2000 summer. I was very powerfully led by the Lord at that time, and I discovered a great deal of his secrets at that time. I had just turned 40. It was the appropriate year. Yes, the reference to the stones of fire in verse 16 here. It says, Thou wast perfect in thy ways from the day thou wast created, until iniquity was found in thee. Literally, this translates as inequity, meaning something went missing. It would appear that maybe he had stolen one of these stones of fire and was using it to promote his own agenda. And I suspect he did something similar with Adam and Eve, using the same stone, or maybe it might even be a different description of the same event to help promote his agenda by giving them this knowledge in these stones of fire, with these stones of fire being crystals or jewels. He's covered with these jewels apparently, and in these jewels is written all knowledge, using the finger of God, which probably a laser or something like that, which can be used and is being used right now to write into jewels and crystals very large amounts of information. This is something that can be done. We know that for sure. So jewels can be used as a means of storing information. And I think that's what's talked about here. One of these jewels was stolen by him, and as a result, he was thrown out because he was abusing his authority. He was using his level of authority to do unjust trafficking and trading and get rich as a result, skimming off the top, if you will, and making a profit from God's work. And God, that wasn't his role. He was like the original mafia boss. He's skimming a little off the top, and his children have been like him ever since. Yeah, that's what it's like. And I also looked up worms. Job is described as having his flesh clothed with worms and clouds of dust. And in the part in Genesis 3, it's Genesis 3:18. It says, "Cursed is the ground for thy sake, and sorrow thou shalt eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to thee." It literally does. It doesn't say thorns also and thistles shall bring forth unto thee. The word literally says, the Hebrew literally says, thorns and thistles will literally come out of you. It says it's referring to thorns and thistles will grow out of you. And that's a very good description of Morgellons, because these people, when they have this stuff growing out of them, they often have these little bits of what appear to be animal or vegetable material kind of falling out of their eyes or out of various orifices or parts of their skin where they have eruptions. It's very similar to the description of Morgellons, and I think that's what happened here. is that when they got involved with this technology, and they probably did this, they were probably in a university lab type environment, as we understand now, because that's how you do technology, do it in a lab environment. They probably developed an early form of Morgellons, and they got loose, and they got infected by it. So they learned the hard way why God told them not to get involved with this, but it gives great benefit in the forms of medicine, but it also can bring destruction in the form of weapons of mass destruction. And in forms of technology like nanotechnology, that when let loose, will be impossible for you to recover. And so the curse was literally, I believe, a nanotechnological virus that went forth from Eden as a result of their unauthorized experiments. And as a result, mankind has been cursed with it ever since. And it's been a running battle between God trying to keep this stuff from taking over. Probably one of the reasons for the flood was to make sure that the stuff had become so ubiquitous that he had to cover everything with a very thick layer of clay in order to keep this stuff from spreading anymore. That was one of the reasons. And also the reason for destroying the Canaanites, because I suspect they were also infected by this stuff. And in the end times, mankind is described as being struck with sores, very similar to the description of Zerat in the book of Genesis. The sores, I believe, are sort of being described here in Genesis 3:18, and also the book of Exodus, the Zerat in Leviticus 13. All the same disease making regular reappearances as a result of being spread by the activity of the fallen angels who are trying to use it to enslave mankind.
Excuse me. And I want to clarify this, because William Bramley said something a long time ago and has been criticized for this information. He had talked about documenting about how the fallen angels, as the alien presence, how they were responsible for spreading disease. In fact, that they were the ones that initially spread chemtrails, and that he had historically documented the outbreak of the plague, and I believe it was the Spanish flu. And he was talking about the incidences of where they saw these crafts spraying these clouds of stuff. So, are you saying that the fallen angels, over the history of mankind and their interdiction, that they have used diseases and genetically modified bacteria, viruses, whatever, to cull and also to decimate the human population?
And that too, generally speaking, but I believe they are used to manage the human population to some extent. But the one I'm talking about is the kind of the worst of all diseases, the nanovirus called Morgellons. They've been using this, I believe, as an attempt to make the earth impure, so that mankind, the Holy Spirit, cannot manifest itself in an efficient way. Part of the earthly defense they're building up, I believe, against the second coming, is filling the air with impurities and things that will enhance their power, their technology, and that will make it more difficult for God to attack. It's like setting up traps and pit traps and things like that before an enemy attacker. But I thought the description of Lucifer falling in Isaiah 14 being covered with worms, it's the same word that described the worms coming up out of the earth in the book of Exodus, coming up out of the earth and devouring the leftover manna, and also in other parts, the Zerat, the Megaphah. The Israelites were battling against this stuff throughout the Exodus period, to the point where I suspect that they had been set up, the ark and they had been set up specifically to destroy this stuff, which had been spreading for some time as a result of the activity of the fallen angels, and had become pernicious throughout the entire region. And the reason for the falling of the manna for 40 years and the Israelites wandering was to basically destroy all this stuff when their feet passed over it. The activity of the power of the Holy Spirit and of the manna, generally speaking, was kind of just destroying this stuff, drying it up out of the earth and killing it. And that was one of the reasons for the wanderings, was to destroy this stuff, kind of vacuum it up and kill it before it spread out and took over the earth again, as I suspect it had been doing in the world before the flood. This is one of the major kind of unseen things we see in the Bible. It's kind of a, if you'll forgive the pun, a red thread that's kind of runs throughout the narrative underneath everything. And if you recall, Rahab used a red thread to pull up the two spies in the land of Canaan. I think that may have been a play, and there may have been purposely used as a means of making clear the cipher that was running throughout the entire narrative, is that the red thread had run throughout Canaan and had taken over these little red worms, which are figuratively described as red threads because they're very small and thin. And they manifest themselves as these fibers erupting out of people's skin, just like Morgellons. And probably the reason that God commanded that everyone be destroyed and that no one take any spoil is because the entire region was, everyone, all the animals, all the people, everything had been corrupted with this stuff and they had to be wiped out. It was a plague, and the only way to deal with it was to destroy everyone, unfortunately. So not only was the activity of the fallen angels and giving over them to strange flesh, but also there was at least one major disease, nanotechnological disease, which had taken over the people of the region and made it so they had to be destroyed. There was no other way around it.
Doug, and I know we're quickly running out of time, but I think that we do that with you quickly and so fast because you've got so much to talk about. But I want to spend some time talking about the serpent cults and why it was that the Canaanite lines or those civilizations that followed the fallen angels and the myriad gods, why it was that they revered the serpent, and if you could tie that into these reptilian beings or the Nagas as being referenced by certain cultures around the world.
Probably the reptilians. I don't know much about that, to be honest. I haven't studied it much. But the study of reptiles, the serpent appeared in the garden. That was this representation of Satan. They appear to be related to reptiles somehow. Possibly it has to do with the fallen angels, the alien presence. Perhaps they made bodies that were made of serpentine DNA, thus their resemblance to snakes. Possibly because it lasted longer or because it was more malleable, simpler to work with. Who knows? But the snake seems to be a universal symbol of natural power. And the people who go after natural power and worship the earth and things of the earth tend to worship those things that are earthly in nature. And the serpent seems to be a classic example of that type of power. Thus the need to... I haven't heard much of the serpent cult of Satan, though. I'd be interested in hearing what you have to say about it.
Well, there's a guy, Philip Gardner. He does a lot of research into this particular area and this particular field. Except that he thinks that as Christianity and Judeo-Christian heritage and culture is a newer thing, and that it has less relevance to these ancient serpent cults and their worship of these serpent gods. And if you look into, if you do some research into it, you'll find like all the different cultures, they've got mythology pertaining to dragon-like beings, and you'll find that a lot of these cultures say that they received wisdom and their high culture and civilization from, like the feathered serpent, the Quetzalcoatl or Kukulkan, which is also another form of the feathered serpent. But you'll see all these references to these dragon-like beings, reptilian beings, as referenced in Genesis 3, where the Lord, talks about this serpent that was this upright being that was speaking to Eve, the Nahash, and how he seduced and beguiled Eve, and then it was after their curse that they lost their limbs and were put on their bellies, but they still have the capacity to shapeshift. And in studying the ancient mythologies of the world, you'll find this mythology and the references to these particular beings all over the world. And often what you'll find in studying the cultures and civilizations that do worship these particular beings is that there was a demand for blood sacrifice and for blood, to keep certain cycles going, to keep the moon or the sun, rising in the sky. I mean, whatever reason it was that the serpent or Quetzalcoatl or Satan, or in whatever form he came to the different peoples, he did ask them for blood sacrifices and to murder, certain victims on certain days, during rituals on certain holy days, like the solstices or the equinoxes, which are the eclipses for these particular olden cultures. But that was one of the reasons why you find in these pagan cultures, even like with the Aztecs, the demand for so much blood, and why they were tied to such atrocious rites. And we also see a reference in the Bible. The Lord always talks to us, and he warns us to not bow before any false gods or any of these idols, false little gods, because these cultures worship these fallen angels, and they were in fact they do exist. They are a reality. They are part of the reality of this plane of existence. And so for those that haven't researched it or have denied it for so long, they if you do your research, you'll find them in names like the Nagas or the Chitauri or even the Chupacabra. I mean, there's different names all over the world for the same kind of demonic experience. Doug, do you want to comment on that, and then we'll go into something else?
Yeah, it's the Earth has always been thought of as a dragon or a spirit or inhabited by a dragon spirit. It's described, in the Inu Elish, the Earth is described as Tiamat, which is a sea dragon. In the Bible, the Earth is equated to Leviathan, also in the Canaanite myth, also called Leviathan in Canaanite myths. And it's variously referred to as a dragon or a serpent of various types. And the Satan is referred to as a serpent. It seems to be the power of evil is embodied in a serpentine form. It's just not really clear why that happened, but it seems to be from the beginning. Perhaps the serpents who travel underfoot are very dangerous with their venom. Kind of a sneaky and dishonorable way of attacking someone. Perhaps it's the way that evil seems to work. They're very sneaky and they non-confrontational, and they lie and so forth. And that's the way that Satan and the fallen angels act. They don't work in an obvious way. They work behind the scenes to corrupt people and bring them down in an indirect and dishonorable way. And so they are lower than the dust. They're literally in hell beneath the earth. And as like a snake who lives in a burrow and travels low to the earth, it would make sense that such a creature would symbolize such low and evil and wicked individuals, wicked beings, which exist and have existed in the earth since before the creation of mankind. So, yeah, I think that's the Nagas and all the other serpent beings are basically a way of describing the evil spirits that inhabit the earth, as well as the good ones in heaven. The ones on earth are described as serpents, because they seem to be serpentine and surreptitious and sneaky in character. Still there?
Hey, Doug, are you still there? And I apologize. The power went out here in Georgia, everyone, so I got disconnected. I do apologize. I'm going to see if I can bring up, I'm not even sure as far as logged into Blog Talk or not, but I'm opening up all those screens. Please bear with me. I apologize. And if we did lose Doug, I'll invite him again at some other point so that we can follow up on this conversation. He's always an interesting guest and always has a lot of information to bring forward. So just give me a couple minutes. I'm going to see if I can log in, and then we'll see if we can get Doug back with us. Give me just a minute, everyone. Once I get to the switchboard, I'll actually play a song, and we'll take a little musical interlude. Hey, Doug, are you there?
Yes.
I apologize. The power went out here in Georgia, so everything shut down. My computer restarted. I'm going to go ahead and open the chat room again, but thanks for waiting for me to come back and to log on and everything. I hope it wasn't too long, but
no. Actually,
we can pick up where. Okay, everybody says that they can hear me. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Doug, and thanks everybody in the listening audience. We're going to skip the musical interlude since Doug is still with us. I was going to try to contact him again, but Doug, can you tell us about, because we've only got 30 minutes remaining, I wanted to ask you about your recent projects. You said you've got this series that you're working on as far as with the Giants, and that you're going to publish another book on the end times. And I know that you do articles for Raiders News Network and that you have several other websites that you run, but do you have time for other projects? I mean, is there other things that you're working on? Because I know you're doing also a number of radio broadcasts. Are there any film or video projects or anything like that?
No, nothing film and video yet. I was thinking we might do I suggested to Tom we do an alternative view on the Star of Bethlehem type thing based on the Planet X theory. He didn't seem too hot on that, but I think he might come around to it because it's getting pretty popular. The problem is we have a very conservative audience with Raiders News Network, so we have to be careful about what we write. So the next book on the Giants will be a little bit more. It'll be more in line with the articles. Planet X was pretty edgy in some ways, and I won't be able to be as outlandish in my book as I'm being with you tonight on your show with my wild theories about firestones and whatnot. But basically with the new Giants story, I'm going to, in the original series, I started off with the Giants and the basic idea of the Giants and how they were formed and why in Eden, and the theory of the fallen angels basically being parasites and self-centered individuals who bred the Giants so they could dominate others and control them, and they use them as proxies to control others. But in the book on Giants, also called Giants in the Earth, which I'll be publishing this fall, I'll take a step back and start off with the entire creation of the universe and why it was created and how, and the original actors and the drama, and why it is that the Giants were ultimately created. And my theory is that heaven, God, and all the spirits were all the only thing that existed in the beginning, before even the universe was created. It was just God surrounded by many millions of angels. And one of these angels was Lucifer, who was originally loyal and just performed a function. My theory was that as he guarded the power that went forth from the throne into all the angels in the assembly, and there was kind of a circuit of power which went forth to the angels, and they returned to God in a form of praise. It's kind of an electrical circuit which went forth and came back. God gave glory or gave power to these angels, and they gave him praise and glory for it. It was like you would have an electrical circuit, forward and back again, but in this case, unlike an electrical circuit, there was no loss of energy. It was perfection. and this is the way it was before the universe was created. But when Satan got the idea one day that he could take some of this power for himself and make his own kingdom, his own reality, and his idea was to skim some off the top, as we discussed earlier. This is the pattern. Skim some off the top and take some of that power for himself and make himself his own God with his own little imaginary kingdom. But as a result of this, my theory was that he took too much power, and there was an explosion. An explosion was what we know to be the creation of the universe, the Big Bang. So God was, but in that scenario, it sounds like Satan created the universe. But in my theory is that God tempted Satan to fall, and that was the way he created the universe, was by tempting Satan with these beliefs that he could create a kingdom of his own apart from God, whereas God was actually tempting him to create this universe because he had a plan. And his plan was to get rid of Lucifer, get rid of Satan, and a number of the other angels whom he predicted correctly would rebel against him. So there was this great and grand plan to remove from the presence of God all of these flawed and evil individuals, these spirits, and ultimately to entrap them in this universe that they themselves sought to create separate from God, who would become a trap for them. And that is my theory. That is the ultimate story of the creation of the universe. And why there is imperfection in the universe, because it was introduced by these fallen angels in their ideas that were added on to God's idea of perfection. Satan, in that sense, the universe is basically heaven plus leaven. It's God's perfection, his perfect ideas, plus Satan's ideas added on top of it. That's why it has aspects of excellence and also death and imperfection. It's God's ideas with Satan's ideas added on, and that's what the universe is. And Jesus even describes it. I thought it was just interesting. The kingdom of God, he said, "Beware the leaven of the Pharisees, because they add to the word of God their own ideas." This is the Talmud and other things that add on to the word of God over and above what he originally wrote. This is the leaven. He described this as like being Satan. This is the way Satan acts. He adds his own ideas on top of God's. And I extrapolated that back to the idea of perhaps the creation of the universe itself was Satan attempting to add his own ideas into the mix in heaven, raise up his voice, say, "I am too. And I also have my ideas, and I have my thoughts, and I'm going to say them." And as a result, this caused a great disruption in the assembly. And he was followed by many other spirits, and possibly as many as a third of them, into this rebellion. This rebellion caused like an embolism and a massive explosion of energy, the energy was no longer flowing properly. And the universe was created as a result of this explosion of energy. And this universe has been used by these fallen angels ever since as a means to attempt to create their own kingdoms apart from that of God in heaven. And God has been constantly pursuing them and trying to tamp them down and get them back under his control again. But he's been unsuccessful. He's been successful because I believe his ultimate plan was to get rid of them. And this gets back to the purpose of evil and how can God, a perfect God, allow imperfection, rebellion, and so forth. It was because ultimately the only logical conclusion one can draw is that he wanted these beings to fall because it was some sort of a larger plan, part of a larger plan. And his larger plan was to remove these imperfections from his presence. These beings who hadn't failed already would have failed if he hadn't given them the opportunity to do so in an orderly way. So by tempting them with this ability with these ideas of having a universe of their own, and tempting Satan into taking some of this power for himself, he made it so these beings would be taken from his presence and ultimately trapped in this universe that they themselves thought they could create for themselves to rule on their own, whereas in actuality it was intended to be a prison for them all along. And in the end, God will have the last laugh, because that was his intention. Satan thought he could rebel successfully, but there was never any chance of that happening. But in the process, God achieved his goals of getting rid of Satan and replacing him with Jesus, his son. And that was his ultimate goal. And I don't think Satan did not know that until near the very end, 2,000 years ago. So he's desperate now, and in the end times when he's thrown down to earth as the last place of battle, his last chance, that's when things get really desperate. And that's described
really, he knows his time is short.
Because he knows his time is short. He's lost,
I've got
and he's about to lose everything.
Absolutely. I've got 2 questions for you from the chat room. Real quick questions. One is, do you know Steve Queller, know of his work? And then the other is, how are the dinosaurs tied in with the Nephilim? And are they hybrid beings as well?
Okay. I do not know Steve Queller, but I listened to him and I've read his work. He does a very good job. Regarding the dinosaurs, I suspect they are experimentations by the fallen angels, unauthorized experiments. That the fallen angels had come down before even mankind had been created, and had attempted to create their own vessels which they could use to interact with the earth. Their initial attempts were crude, but with additional experimentation, they became more and more refined to the point where they were able to create primitive man-like beings, but not true mankind, and ape-like creatures. Possibly that's why you have so many different versions of mankind. But God came down and created his version, which is the current version, which was perfectly suited to its environment, unlike the creations of the fallen angels, which were, even though they were clever, they were imperfect and eventually died out. I suspect that the dinosaurs were the experiments of fallen angels.
Yeah, I think you're right, because we have all those other monstrosities too, that are mentioned in like mythology, these hybrid creatures like with the Minotaur and the Cyclopses and the different things like that.
Yes.
We had mentioned earlier talking about Genesis 3:15 and the enmity, and the Lord had talked when he cursed the serpent and put him on his belly. He said that he would eat the dust of the earth. And this is leading to my next question for you, Doug, because it seems like we know that Adam was also the dust of the earth, and that our bodies are the dust of the earth. One of the questions that was asked in the chat room is that, do you think these fallen angels, these reptilian gods, these fallen gods, that they feed off of humanity in some way as the dust of the earth? Because the Lord said that, that they would feed off the dust of the ground. Because there seems to be rumors and also other eyewitness testimony as to these underground bases and certain weirdness going on down there, that these aliens, these fallen angels, actually eat people, and that even the Roswell, the ships that were brought down in 1947, that there were human body parts found on those particular planes, and that was one of the reasons, on those ships, and that was one of the reasons why the governments clamped down and freaked out. Do you have a comment here on this?
The dust of the earth, yeah. They do live underground, but I think that reference was actually to the Zerat, Morgellons I was referring to, the tiny red worms that are snake-like in character. This is what Satan's primary method of trying to enslave mankind was. The dust of the earth, these things will crawl through the dust of the earth and try to invade our bodies through our feet. And so when it says that in Genesis 3:18, when Adam and his descendants would go out into the field, this stuff would enter into their bodies through their feet and manifest as thorns and thistles coming out of their skin, what we now know as Morgellons. So the eating the dust of the earth, it means that this stuff, their technology and their power will reside in the dust, and it will plague mankind, biting them on the heel, just like the prophecy of Dan. It says Dan will be an adder in a path; he will bite the heel. That's what they're referring to. In Genesis 3:15. The curse of the serpent, the man will crush his head, but the serpent will bite his heel. This is what they're referring to. They're referring to this disease biting at the heels of mankind and entering into the body through the feet. The Megapha is referred to as literally a disease that strikes at the foot. That's what they were talking about. The disease of Egypt, the Zerat. The curse of the serpent was wherever we walked on the earth, there was a possibility that this disease would infect us through the dust of the earth. That's what they're talking about. So anyone who does not have the Holy Spirit in them or is not protected via the Holy Spirit somehow will ultimately fall prey to this stuff.
Would you also say that this is also part of the wrath of God poured out not on those not written into the book of life? Because you know how it talks about that the sores will come up all over those not written into the book of life.
I think that's the sixth bowl judgment.
Go ahead, Doug.
I believe that's the sixth bowl judgment. I think you're right. Those who take the mark will receive these. Will get infected by this stuff. I think we talked about this before too. Basically, it'll be a two-stage process. One will be to take the mark, which will be a microchip type thing, but it'll be only a limited range. But in order to increase the range and the amount of control the chip will have over the body, mankind, and this is described in Revelation 9:11, will be infected by this virus, and this will create like Morgellons does, an interior network of fibers inside the body, which will act as a network, which will hook up to the chip and allow the chip to give commands to the various internal organs, muscles, and so forth, which will literally enslave the body and allow it to be essentially controlled by a computer. So you could actually, by sending electrical impulses to the muscles, they could actually override the electrical impulses sent by the brain and cause people to do things that they wouldn't do normally, literally controlling the body. And this is the threat that the serpent has upon mankind. Once the stuff infects you, it will eventually take you over. And if the evil is advanced enough, they'll implant a chip in you and use that stuff to remote control you. They can track where you wherever you go. And also the wiring will allow them to send and receive signals over long distances. So they can see wherever you are at and control you wherever you're at. And you have no hope of escape.
Do you think that's also why it says that men will seek death, but death will flee from them? Because they would have to be almost in an incapacitated state, like they're not in control of their bodies or their minds, that they can't do what they want. They don't have free will anymore.
Yes, and that was one of the parameters I came to that conclusion. And in order to not be able to kill yourself, because you can do yourself in if you're desperate enough. I mean, if you're in agony or whatever, you can do it. And I absolutely am not encouraging that whatsoever. But in the end times, men will come to the point where they have absolutely no hope and they're in terrible agony, and some will try to kill themselves. And the only way that's possible is if there is some sort of other force physically controlling them and keeping them from doing it. And that was one of the criteria for this end times control grid. I envisioned the only way they could do this is that they would have to have something inside the body which is physically controlling it and overriding the impulses to the muscles, so they couldn't pull the trigger or take the pill or whatever. It would have to be some sort of internal control network which overrides the body and makes it so it's no longer under the person's control.
Yeah, I think you're right there, Doug. And we've got 11 minutes remaining, and I'm going to ask you kind of an unfair question because you won't be able to answer this in 10 minutes, and we'll be able to pick it up at some other time, I'm certain. But wanted to ask you where you see things heading as far as the short term, and also as far as the unfolding of the New World Order and Bible prophecy. And and then you can tie in also with Planet X, the return of the Nephilim, the giants, the Great Deception. Real small question here, Doug.
Okay. Yeah, that's pretty narrow. I think in the near term, I think the president is being used as a sock puppet for the Illuminist agenda. I don't think he's really his own man. I think the fact that we're getting into many different wars is actually fulfilling one of the prophecies of Daniel, which describes a multi-phased war, attacks on many different Middle Eastern countries, which is pretty much the same as the ones we're seeing now, including now Libya and Afghanistan, and possibly Syria. There's a description in the book of Daniel, I forget the chapter, how the Antichrist will actually attack from ancient Iraq through Syria, but not into the children of Ammon, which is Saudi Arabia. But he will also attack Egypt, Libya, and also possibly Egypt, and the rest of northeastern Africa will be under its control. And this is basically what we're seeing now, and this has never happened before. What we're seeing now, we're seeing the fulfillment of prophecy. I think it's maybe Daniel 9 or 10. I'll take a look. But we're seeing the fulfillment of that prophecy now, I think. And that's one thing that's happening now. But I think possibly the 2012 timeline, December 11th or whatever it is, December 21st, 2012, can actually be the beginning of the tribulation. It's beginning to look like that's a possible beginning point. That or sometime around there. So I think over the next couple of years, if you haven't started stocking up food and thinking in terms of survival, you might want to start doing that. Thinking about moving away from the major cities into mid-size and small neighborhoods out in the urban areas and close to the suburban areas, outskirts of the suburban areas. Buy a house that's reasonably priced, they can pay off, maybe get it totally paid off. Keep your expectations reasonable over the next several years. I think at the very best we can hope for with the current administration is more of the same. Frankly, I think they're actively trying to destroy the economy and the country, but that's my opinion.
Right.
If that's their purpose, was to bring us down, not to raise us up. That's people who don't think that are, in my opinion, pretty stupid. Because nobody's that dumb. These guys are doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. It's just not working. Our economy's being battered even more than it was before. So I would expect more of the same, and keep your expectations reasonable. Continue to build relationships within the church with people whom you can trust. Make sure to strengthen your family relationships, and of course, above all, your relationship with Jesus. After that, once you have all that in place, everything else will take care of itself, and you will fulfill your destiny as your Father in heaven wrote for you.
Yeah, absolutely, Dad. I think you're right. And I see all this unfolding in a similar fashion. We agree on so many points. I want to ask you, Doug, to give out your contact information, your website information, where people can go to read your articles and the different websites you write for.
Okay. You can read my articles, most of them about the giants, at www.mysteriousworld.com. There's also some additional books or articles on Planet X at Raiders News Network. They're not linked to from the homepage, so I think over the next couple of weeks I'll probably post them on my Planet X site at planet-x.info, planetx.info. And you can contact me by email at publisher@mysteriousworld.com if you have any questions.
I've got one final unfair question for you, Doug, in the last couple minutes here. What about the rapture? Because Talis is asking, won't we be raptured? ?
The rapture is one of the greatest false doctrines ever propagated. The rapture as in being at the beginning of tribulation. First of all, the rapture doesn't exist. The term snatching away exists. That's fine. But the rapture as currently formulated is a terrible lie. It's terrible. It's been tremendous damage to the church and our ability to prepare. The resurrection, the correct term, will happen after the seventh trumpet as described in the book of Revelation and other books of the New Testament. There's no evidence whatsoever for the pre-tribulational rapture. It's disgraceful, false doctrine. And those who propagated it will be punished in heaven because they profited from shearing the sheep of God, and God doesn't like that very much. So I recommend you divest yourself from that thought pattern immediately and think about it in terms of surviving the end times, following the advice I gave previously about strengthening your relationships with your God, your family, and your Christian brethren, keeping your material expectations reasonable, paying off all your bills, and preparing for the worst times 1,000.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to tell everybody this, because this is my experience. I just recently ordered a year's supply of dehydrated food that has a 30-year lifespan for 2 people, and it took 3 months, over 3 months to take delivery, people. So if you can, go ahead and get it now, because who knows? Who knows how long or when? But I agree, Doug, that no matter what kind of provisions or no matter what we do, that the most important thing is to have a relationship with our Lord and to get all of that taken care of first and foremost. Final comment, Doug. 2 minutes.
Okay. I think what we have with this unraveling end-time scenario is a gradual degradation of the Christian and Judeo-Christian ethic in America. We have the entire world working to bring us down to their level, particularly our enemies in the East, the Russians and the Chinese, have been funding and fomenting insurrection and backwards and ungodly ideas for decades now. And it's beginning to really take its toll. I suspect Mr. Obama is actually a communist agitator who was promoted to position the highest level of office and is doing his very best and a very efficient job of destroying the country.
Yes,
if you expect to be able to rely on the United States and to remain a godly nation run by godly people, I think you're following a fool's errand. Your mind should be always on God and following God, and wherever your feet land, that's where He wants you to be, whether it's the United States or a post-Christian country we're ending up in now, where people like us may end up being persecuted, imprisoned, or even killed, and you'll have to prepare for that mentally and spiritually, and prepare for the worst because it's about to happen.
Last question, yes or no question. Do you think that America is mentioned as the last days Babylon, Revelation 17:18?
Yes, they're referring to New York City, and there are specific events described in the book of Revelation and the book of actually Zechariah describe these specific events, the 9/11 event and its aftermath, which you can talk about sometime if you want to. But the greatest head of the dragon is, in fact, the United States after World War III. In which there will be a nuclear exchange between the United States and Russia after the failed attempt by the Russians to conquer Israel.
Yeah, Doug, I think we're going to have to do another show on this. God bless everybody. May the Lord keep you and watch over you and keep you and your loved ones safe and all your animals and extended family. And don't believe anything we say. Take this before Him in discernment and ask His blessings. And ask His confirmation and all these things. Thank you, Doug. We'll talk to you soon. God bless everyone.
Thank you. God bless.
Making us whole, it's all in the choices we're given. restoring our vision for living to know once again.